All right. Welcome, everyone. We have a lot that we're going to try and cover today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is Wildfire Active Management and Community Safety, fighting back against the logging push endangering communities and forests. We've already got a full room. We've been told we're not allowed to have people pack in and sit on the floor.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and call it full.
Okay, we have one presenter who, there we go. Definitely got to let her in.
There's a couple seats up front.
Yeah, there's two more over here, too. Okay. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Chad Hansen.
Thank you. All right, hey everybody. I'm Dr. Chad Hansen. I'm a wildfire scientist with the John Muir Project. And I'm going to be talking this morning about the common narrative that we hear from land management agencies and some politicians and oftentimes in the press, that the forests are overgrown, and because they're overgrown and they're too dense, too many trees, live trees, dead trees, that we need to remove a lot of the trees, maybe even most of the trees from the forest in order to curb wildfire intensity and severity, and that the fires are burning too hot because the forests are too dense. That's the basic narrative, and one of the things that goes along with that narrative is that the environmental laws are in the way. The National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, other environmental laws. We're even hearing a narrative that the Wilderness Act is in the way. We need to repeal the environmental laws or weaken them so that we can get in there and do active management. The way that's defined is a whole lot of logging and other tree removal. So I'm going to be talking about that and about a whole lot of science that is not being conveyed to the public and is typically left out of that narrative or is misrepresented in the narrative. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, is what you aren't being told. So here are a few key points. Fires are much more likely to occur in managed forests with significant road density. They are not less likely to occur in areas where there is more management and more roads. They're more likely to occur. Denser forests do not tend to burn more intensely. All things being equal, they tend to burn less intensely because of a climate buffer that is provided by those denser, higher canopy cover conditions. I'll talk about why that is a little bit more. When mechanical thinning or other logging occurs, and mechanical thinning is logging, when that occurs, it actually changes the microclimate of the forest and undermines that climate buffer, and that actually can create hotter, drier, and windier conditions that make a forest more fire prone, and it tends to strongly increase the speed of winds through the forest because it reduces the windbreak effect that a denser forest has, and that wind speed drives flames faster and you get faster rate of spread in ways that can put communities at tremendous risk. And I'll talk about that a little bit more too. And this is a big one. There is no need to remove trees before fire. If we want more fire in the forests, in places where there's a fire deficit, which is true in most western US forests, conifer forests, you can do burning, whether it's managed wildfire, whether it's prescribed fire, whether it's indigenous cultural burning. You can have more fire and there's no need to remove trees. That is an absolute myth. We've got half a century of science proving that. It doesn't matter how dense the forest is, it doesn't matter if it hasn't burned in a century. I'll talk about that too. And this is a big one. Mechanical thinning kills far more trees than it prevents from being killed. In the research that is put out by the Forest Service again and again promoting thinning, they do not account for tree mortality from thinning itself. It is a massive source of bias. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then the second to last one is, historical forests were much, much denser on average than the public has been told. A lot of data has been omitted, and that has skewed the impression of what historical forests were. They were actually much more diverse and variable than previously claimed. And last, the goal of simply trying to prevent high intensity fire categorically is no longer an ecologically defensible goal given what we know. These fires were always mixed intensity historically, and a certain portion, a significant portion of the biodiversity actually depends on the high intensity component. So those are the things I'm just going to cover briefly. First of all, let's talk about some of the research on active management and what we see in terms of the fires in those areas where more active management has occurred and where you've got more roads. Fires are 2 to 4 times more likely to occur in forests with more active management and more road networks because you can't have the logging operations, the mechanical thinning without roads. Other researchers found that 90% of all wildfires occur within half a mile of a road, and there's a very strong correlation between proximity to roads and increased wildfire occurrence. We have over 360,000 miles of roads on the National Forest System that can circle the globe more than 14 times. We do not need more roads on the National Forest System, we need far less. And so, the whole narrative that if we had more logging and more roads to support that logging, we could stop all these fires. That narrative is contradicted by the science. All right. Now I can only cover so much in this time period, so just bear in mind that any study I cite on these points, there's a lot more that I could cite, and we have a lot of those on the John Muir Project's website. If you go to the public education page and scroll down to the bottom, we have fact sheets with lots of citations. So just so you know that. But this is one of the studies, it's all been done in 2018. If you see here, this forest biomass goes up on the x-axis here. That's denser and denser forest with more biomass per hectare or per acre. And that curvy line, that's fire severity. So as biomass goes up, fire severity comes down. In other words, the densest forests actually have somewhat relatively lower fire severity, not higher severity. And it's because of that climate buffer that I was talking about. Here's research from Hockenberg et al. 2024, pretty recent study. The graph seems a little bit complicated, but if you pay attention to the blue line in particular, what they find is in the really, really sparse forests, the forests that are just kind of marginally forests, fire severity is lower because it's not really forest anyway. And then you've got a little bit higher fire severity, kind of at the middle density levels. This is about understory trees. This is not about overall forest density. This is specifically about small trees, less than 10 inches in diameter. And what's interesting for me about this is that the highest densities of small trees, fire intensity comes down, doesn't go up. Which is really interesting because what we've been told is a lot of people will say, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't be removing the mature trees, right? They acknowledge that that's probably not going to curb fire intensity. Maybe it will actually exacerbate fire intensity. But they say, well, we really should at least remove the small trees in the understory, and that will curb fire intensity. This research indicates that that isn't really well supported either. And I suspect that a lot of this has to do with the effect that that dense understory has on winds, because it's such a windbreak that the winds can't sweep through the forest nearly as quickly. And this is a really interesting one. There's a lot of other studies on this, but the narrative is if forests haven't burned in a long time, if fire has been excluded, then they're going to be really, really dense, and of course they're going to burn much more intensely because of fuel accumulation, because of forest densification. We're finding that's not true either. Forests, if they haven't burned in a long time, they pretty much they still burn at mostly low and moderate intensity, and they typically don't have higher levels of high intensity fire, they often have lower levels. So this black line here, the black zone, that's high intensity fire, the gray is moderate, the light gray is low intensity. As you can see, TSF is time since fire. So this bar here, that's more than 75 years since the previous fire, and the level of high intensity fire is actually at the lowest there. It's not the only study that's found that. There are several others. I've done research on this too. I didn't find any difference, not lower or higher, just no difference at all. For me, what that all means is that it's not about forest density. It's not about whether it's burned 30 years ago or 120 years ago. It's about the weather and the climate. These are weather-driven events. These are climate events. Those are the factors that govern how fires burn. So the whole narrative about overgrown forests is misplaced, and frankly, in my opinion, it's kind of a new form of climate denialism. Okay, so these are just some of the many, many studies that have found that removing trees from forests, including mechanical thinning, tends to increase fire intensity, or that denser forests tend to have lower fire intensity. Most of these are U.S. Forest Service studies. That one right there, by the way, the second one, that should say PIELC et al. 2025. That's a typo. But bottom line is that the research is finding that previous fire will have an effect for a temporary period of time, usually several years. But thinning is not the issue. It's not what's going to determine fire behavior. If anything, it will oftentimes exacerbate fire behavior. And the Forest Service researchers have known this for a long time. And look at the one study here. This is a kind of a classic one by one of the Forest Service's scientists, Countryman. In 1956, found that what they didn't call it thinning back then, they called it selective logging, but it's basically similar to what is called mechanical thinning now. Fire spread is 4.5 times faster and would require 20 times the fire suppression effort compared to fire in a dense forest. So this isn't something that they're just figuring out. They've known this for over half a century. In terms of the recent research, we have a group of U.S. Forest Service scientists conducting a massive study of several hundred fires, analyzing data over the course of 3 decades in the entire Pacific Northwest, including in dry forests and including in moist forests, and finding that, quote here, hotter, drier, and windier, forests with lower biomass, the more open forests, have higher fire severity. That was their basic finding. And the reason for that, they said, is because, quote, hotter, drier, and windier microclimates, and those conditions decrease dramatically over relatively short distances into the interior of older forests with multi-layer canopies and high tree density. In other words, in forests that are denser and have higher tree densities, those are the areas with the lower fire intensities, not higher. So again, contrary to the narrative that's been beaten into our heads again and again. Another study by Forest Service scientists, largely the same group, and they found that denser, older forests with high canopy cover had lower fire severity and they, quote, buffer the negative effects of climate change regarding wildfires. And this quote is so important. I'm just gonna read it. I'm not gonna do a lot of this, but I do think this is relevant enough that I'm gonna read the whole quote. Thinned forests have more open conditions which are associated with higher temperatures, lower relative humidity, higher wind speeds, and increasing fire intensity. Furthermore, live and dead fuels in young forest or thin stands with dense saplings or shrub understory will be drier, making ignition in high heat more likely, and the rate of spread higher because of the relative lack of wind breaks provided by closed canopies with large trees, end quote. So again, there is a lot of research on this, and there's a lot more studies saying the same thing by independent scientists, by university scientists, by Forest Service scientists that I can cover in this presentation. But just so you all have an understanding that these are the biggest and most comprehensive studies that are being done out there. More Forest Service research, thinning reduces wind resistance, increases wind speeds. In this study, they found that it increased wind speeds by 15 to 20 times relative to unthinned forests. And those increased wind speeds dramatically increase fire spread. Bouch et al. 2023, they found that the #1 factor associated with destruction of communities from wildfires and loss of lives in wildfires is the speed of fires. And the thing that increases the speed of fires most is reducing forest density, including by so-called mechanical thinning. More Forest Service scientists, Culkin et al. 2023, saying basically that the management regime of the Forest Service over recent decades to do huge logging projects out in the forest wildlands, big mechanical thinning projects, and claiming that's going to curb fires and protect communities by stopping the fire from reaching the community. That's been the dominant management approach. Telling communities, you don't need to worry, we've done this big logging project out there in the backcountry, out there over the ridge, and it'll stop a fire from reaching the town. This is the Forest Service's own scientists in a recent study saying that approach has been an utter failure. The fires are blowing right through these big thin areas and they're burning down towns and oftentimes claiming many lives. And their conclusion was, the research is very solid that that's a failure. We need to stop that. We need to focus on the communities and help communities become fire safe. And that's where our focus and our effort and our resources should be, is home hardening, defensible space pruning, and evacuation planning and assistance, not backcountry logging. So similar to what I said a moment ago about how the Forest Service's own scientists know and have known for years, decades even, that thinning is not an effective wildfire management strategy and can actually be counterproductive. The Forest Service's scientists also know that there's no need to remove trees to have fire in the forest. And this is a quote from a recent Forest Service document. It is known that tree removal is not required before prescribed fire can be used. They've also admitted the same thing with regard to managed wildfire. It's also true with regard to Indigenous cultural burning, the Forest Service does not need to tell the tribes that they can't burn or put up barriers to indigenous burning, or tell the tribes that they have to do the logging project before they can burn. That's all unnecessary and unnecessarily burdensome and destructive. We want fire in the forest, we can have fire in the forest, it's not about logging. In addition, the Forest Service admits that thinning and thinning plus burning is 6 times more expensive per acre than just fire alone. So you don't have to do the thinning, and it's vastly more expensive if you do. So why are we doing it? It's because they want to get logs to the mill, they want to generate revenue. And here are just some of the many, many studies documenting that. Great majority of these are studies by the Forest Service's own scientists, by Park Service scientists. There are many more, again, as a fact sheet on our website about this, on the John Muir Project's website called Fire Alone. But this is just an example of some of the studies. The point is that even in the densest forests, even the forests that haven't burned in over a century, the same thing is true. These are fires that are being conducted during fire season, both managed wildfire and also prescribed burns in some of the densest forests that are out there. And where they want predominantly low intensity fire effects, that's what they're getting. And obviously there's reasons to have moderate high intensity fire effects too, ecologically, but if that's what they want, they can certainly get that. And there's no tree removal before burning in these studies. This is the results of some of my research in the Creek Fire, where I found that the forests with a logging history conducted under the guise of fuel reduction, post-fire logging or mechanical thinning, prior to the Creek Fire, those areas actually burned more intensely, not less intensely. And so areas with more so-called active management, more tree removal, more logging, it didn't reduce fire intensity, it actually increased fire intensity. And this is a pretty typical picture of a really, really dense forest that mostly burned at low intensity, just like this. Now some burned at high intensity too, of course, because that's what the weather dictated at that moment. But the narrative that a dense forest will almost always burn at high intensity because it's too dense, or that an open forest will almost always burn at low intensity because it's open, that narrative is completely contradicted by the science. This is an area that was mechanically thinned before the fire. It burned at high intensity in a crown fire. It had very open conditions, very little understory vegetation. It burned intensely because that's what the weather dictated at that moment. This area was heavily mechanically thin. There was almost no understory whatsoever in here, and it burned in a crown fire because that's what the weather dictated. It wasn't about the density of the forest, and low density forest conditions didn't prevent crown fire. This area was one of the most heavily managed areas in the entire fire footprint. It was private lands, managed by Southern California Edison, and they had been doing thinning and prescribed burning for over 40 years in these forests repeatedly, ostensibly to make them fire resilient, and this was one of the larger high intensity fire patches in the whole fire. And of course, right after it, they went in and did post-fire logging, which is what you can see here. So again, this burned at that intensity because that's what the weather dictated, ultimately. Same thing with areas that were post-fire logged before the fire in earlier fires. It didn't reduce fuels and prevent high intensity fire. Those areas burned at high intensity if that's what the weather dictated, just like this area here. So, one of the other things that's left out of the conversation is the fact that there are studies by Forest Service scientists that promote thinning and say it's effective to curb wildfire. There are certainly studies that say that. Here's what they're not telling you. They're not telling you that they killed most of the trees before the fire got there through thinning itself. They don't include the mortality from thinning itself in their calculations, which is a huge source of bias, and it gives you wildly misleading results. I also don't tell you that most of their study sites were opportunistically selected. It's not random selection, they were chosen, and that actually is another source of bias because, again, there's a lot of randomness. Thinned areas will not always burn at high intensity. Sometimes they burn at low intensity or moderate, just like unthinned forests. And so if they're out there choosing study sites where fire happened to burn at lower intensity where thinning occurred, they will skew a narrative toward thinning. So there's other research on this too, and again, the bottom line is that thinning kills significantly more trees than it prevents from being killed. And that's true also where thinning is conducted supposedly to reduce competition between trees and prevent tree mortality from drought and bark beetles. The mortality from thinning relative to the tiny reduction in mortality from bark beetles is way out of balance. The green areas here, that's the reduced mortality from bark beetles. The orange is the increased mortality from thinning. You can see it is massively out of balance. You're killing dozens and dozens of trees from thinning for every one or less than one tree that you would otherwise theoretically save from bark beetles and drought. The math does not add up. So I'll wrap up very quickly here, but I just want to also cover that thinning is not what people think it is these days. And I will say I've been tracking this for a long time. And when I first started doing this work about 36 years ago, I would go into thinning projects on national forests, and I would say, yeah, I wouldn't have done this. This doesn't look great to me. But oftentimes it was really pretty much small trees, very few trees that were even on the you could call medium size. Some thinning projects even back then were horrible, and they were industrial logging, but many were not. These days, that's thinning most of the time. Increasingly, thinning projects look like clear cuts, and they're going after larger and larger trees. Forest Service is doing project-specific forest plan amendments to eliminate the diameter limits and the basal area retention requirements. And many times thinning looks very close to a clear cut. This is what thinning looks like typically nowadays. And so you can find exceptions, but they're pretty uncommon. This is what thinning looks like most of the time. So last thing I'll cover is just the fact that there's a lot of research out there about much denser forest conditions historically than the Forest Service has reported, and research out there finding that huge amounts of historical data have been omitted in the Forest Service's studies. My colleagues and I have corrected that by publishing the data that they left out, and we found that the forests were much denser on average than the Forest Service has previously claimed. So you can find this information on the John Muir Project's website. You can also email me or give me a call and I'll send you the studies. So where do we go from here? In my view, what it all adds up to is take all the money, the billions of dollars of taxpayer money that's being taken out of our pockets to subsidize logging on public lands under the guises of euphemisms like thinning, fuel reduction, fire management, and forest health, and redirect that money into a jobs program to create fire-safe communities and help communities that are most vulnerable be safe from wildfires through home hardening, defensible space pruning, and evacuation planning and assistance. For more information, you can check out my books.
Hi everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm Paula Hood. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm co-director of Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project. And Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, we work to protect and restore the Eastern Oregon Cascades and the Blue Mountains in Eastern Oregon and Southeastern Washington. Next slide. And field surveying is the heart of the work we do. We're in the field from the beginning of June through September every year, and our staff and volunteers spend thousands of hours every field season surveying proposed timber sales. Next slide. And so I've been with BMBP, Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, for 10 years, and I've been engaged in similar work for over 20 years now. I have an academic background. I have a Master's of Science in Environmental Science. And also BMBP is part of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, the folks who organized this panel. Thank you, Alex. And I'm part of the steering team and also helped found the alliance. And so for Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, we usually focus on field surveying proposed timber sales. So we're focused on trying to save magnificent and ecologically important forests, like the lovely ones here in the slide, before they are logged. But recently we've started doing some targeted post-logging surveys because it's become really apparent that we need to document the discrepancies between what the Forest Service is calling restoration and what we are finding on the ground. Next slide. And so unfortunately, we've been really alarmed all too often by what we have found on the ground. So I'm gonna share a bunch of depressing logging slides with you guys. So I've been highlighting in recent years these post-logging surveys in much of my work. And so I'm going to start with a couple of examples that some of you may have already seen, and then go on to some other things. So we started doing more targeting post-logging surveys in the Big Mosquito and Camp Lick timber sales in the Malheur National Forest. And so for the Big Mosquito sale in particular, the sale was strongly backed by the collaborative group for that district on the Malheur National Forest, and it was touted as a restoration success and a model for what was supposedly a great idea to go ahead and log large fir trees in order to save old-growth ponderosa pine trees, supposedly. And the collaborative and the Forest Service held up this sale as proof that it was a good idea to roll back protections for large trees in eastside forests across the region. And so I decided to go and see for myself what logging in the Big Mosquito timber sale really looked like on the ground. And this was the very first unit that I found when I got out of the truck, and it was very upsetting. And in that middle picture there, we actually Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project field surveyed the sale before it was logged, and so that one's pre-logging. And then that's actually the same hill slope from a different angle in that same unit after logging. Next slide. And so we found dozens of old-growth ponderosa pines that had been logged. And we only had time to document a small portion of these. Next slide. So we took the time to meticulously document and photograph tree rings and everything else of about 30 old-growth ponderosa pines just in this one unit. And those are 150 years old or older. Of those, about 9 were over 200 years old, and a couple were over 300 years old. This one was born in approximately 1687. And so, again, this is just one unit, an 82-acre unit in a thousands of acre timber sale with commercial logging that is thousands of acres. And so these old-growth trees, these ponderosa pine trees, they weren't technically targeted by the Forest Service for logging. They were cut down to clear corridors for cabled assist logging on steep slopes. And the Forest Service also confirmed that they were taken to the mill and sold. Next slide. So then we also started looking next door at the Camp Lick timber sale, which shares a boundary with the Big Mosquito sale. And there too, we repeatedly found old-growth ponderosa pine trees cut down. And that's often because they were in the way of quote-unquote temporary roads. Temporary roads are not really temporary, everybody. Or because they were considered hazards due to their proximity to roads or other logging operations. And so, also, next slide. We also kept finding extremely heavy logging and clear cuts. Next slide. And so this isn't just the Malheur National Forest. This is the slides from the Whitman National Forest that Rob Clavins at Oregon Wild shared with us. And keep in mind, these timber sales are touted as restoration, as fuels reduction, as necessary for safety to the public. And of course, there's an ever-changing bevy of different terms. Next slide. So, calling logging anything but what it is. Next slide. And so through our work with folks at the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, we were also hearing about examples of egregious logging and timber sales throughout the region. So we started working with the Forest Climate Alliance and several groups within the alliance to highlight that this issue is at a larger, more regional scale. And so we've done things like put together a photo repository of egregious logging on federal public lands in the Pacific Northwest. We are also working on a report and story map, and that will be coming out in coming months. Next slide. So here's an example from Washington. Next slide. And there's some from Idaho. And so clearly this isn't a one-off or an isolated issue. We're consistently finding widespread degradation or outright destruction of ecosystems at a scale and severity that frankly surprised even me, and I really thought I was too cynical to be surprised anymore after doing this work for 20 years. Unfortunately, and so, we're consistently finding big old trees cut down, logging in mature and old forests, clear cuts, logging in ecologically sensitive habitats such as post-fire snag forests, logging adjacent to streams, and loss of biodiversity and key wildlife habitats. Next slide. So here's some examples from California. Next slide. some examples from western and southwestern Oregon. Next slide. Here's some from Mount Hood. Next slide. This is also from Mount Hood, and this was actually one of my favorite places in the world in Mount Hood National Forest. This is the Clackamas roadside hazard tree abatement sale. And so they claimed that this was rooted in, safety and necessary for public safety. I will note, looking at this picture, that trees, last I checked, do not fall uphill. And so, next slide. Here's some more, like there's the road uphill from that logging on the right. And actually you can't see it, but the same is true for the one on the left. It goes down slope and then up again before it meets the road. And you can see the old growth logs there. And because this was one of my favorite places in the world, I've thrown in a couple more slides. Next slide. And so they've logged right over this creek. This is part of Sandstone Creek. Also right next to that, you can see that the logging has exacerbated the sediment issues coming down into the road from erosion from all the logging and just the road being there. And then that bottom right picture was taken along that same creek, just up the way a little bit, prior to logging and fire. And I have spent countless hours of my life in this creek and camped with my kid there and everything else. Next slide. And so this is up the road a little way. This is in Whale Creek, and this is the entrance. That little blue gate is the entrance to Indian Henry Campground. And that, so on the top left, that picture is the same creek that one on the top right is taken at. And so, of course, the top right was taken prior to logging and prior to fire. And then that one on the bottom left is also like them logging straight over the creek. Next slide. And this is what it looked like after fire, but in the top two pictures before logging, and those pictures, and I should say that I've credited a lot of these pictures, so a lot of these pictures from different regions are actually not from BMBP, and hopefully you notice the credit on there. But so those two are from BARC, organization in Mount Hood, Watchdogs from Mount Hood. And that middle one was actually in Whale Creek, that same one that's next to Indian Henry Campground with all the logging. That one was taken just upstream of all the logging because that one's actually in the edge of the wilderness area. So they did not log in there. And yeah, it's actually quite lovely. Next slide. So I'm gonna switch focus back to the east side. So this was also a very precious place, and I'm gonna have you go back to the slide in a second, but next slide for a sec. And that's the exact same spot. And so, sorry everybody.
Can you go back?
Yeah.
Trigger warnings.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And so BMBP actually fought very hard to stop logging at this sale. We tried to take it, we challenged it, we unfortunately lost. But I also do, actually I'm gonna send you back to the previous slide real quick. So just to note about, I wanna sort of highlight a couple things about Eastern Oregon forests here. So clearly not all of forests in Eastern Oregon are dry ponderosa pine forests. Many are quite lush, quite moist, and there's a diverse array, a complex mosaic of forest types on the east side, and that includes dry open ponderosa pine to very moist mixed conifer forests. Also, about half of Oregon's forests are on the east side of the state, east side of the Cascade Crest, so, care about forests there too. They also support wildlife corridors that have regional importance. They connect the Rockies to the Cascades, and they support world-class fishing and key populations of salmon. Next slide. And next slide. And so, unfortunately, forests in Eastern Oregon and southeastern Washington are also frequently overlooked. And so they tend to receive a lot less public oversight and public scrutiny compared to west side forests. And as a consequence, they're often used as a testing ground for bad logging policies on national forests, and they're treated as a sacrifice zone. Next slide. And so, unfortunately, this is another example of a truly ecologically unique and magnificent forest that was unfortunately logged. And again, I want to note that these sales are presented to the public as restoration and as necessary for fuels reduction or public safety and as thinning. Next slide. And despite that, you can see many from space. And so this is actually in the Deschutes National Forest. This is the Lex and Junction timber sales. I just wanted to highlight how intense it can be. Next slide. And so I also wanted to share some photos with you from the tiger. Oops, sorry. This is actually go back to the next one. Sorry, Alex. So this is the tollgate sale in the Umatilla National Forest. You can also see that one from space, and that one's actually really close to. Next slide. The Tiger Mill timber sale. And so I wanted to share some photos with you from Tiger Mill. Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project field surveyed this sale over 2 summers recently, and it has not yet been logged. However, they've started selling the contracts for portions of this sale. And many sale units, including those where the Forest Service is planning to log large trees, will be left with residual basal areas as low as 30 or 40%, and that includes this unit. Which we field surveyed and I cross-checked with the contract. So in the Tony contract, which is the contract that covers part of the southern portion of the Tiger Mill sale, there are over 500 acres of mature and old forests where logging is scheduled to remove up to 60 to 70% of the basal areas and leave only 3 of the large trees left per acre. So again, that's 500 acres of mature and old forests that will lose 60 to 70% of their basal area and only have 3 large trees left per acre. And so, we're really scared that this will be extremely devastating to these beautiful and largely intact mature and old forests. This sort of heavy industrial logging is also on par with practices that we've seen correlated with increased stream temperature and fine sediment in downstream streams, and with increased fire risk, as Chad was alluding to, or telling us about. Next slide. And so in the Tiger Mill sale area, the Forest Service admits straight up that 87% of the project area has never been logged. That's in their documentation. And then about 60% of it is made up of moist forests. It's also incredibly steep. And so approximately 84% of the project area has sloped over 35%. And then in there also, like 62% of the project area has slopes that are over 50%. That's incredibly steep. Next slide. And so even though not all logging on the ground contains clear cuts and logging of big old trees, I want to really highlight that we don't have a lot of those legacy trees or mature and old forests left. We only have a small fraction remaining on the landscape. And for example, on east side forests, like specifically those in the Blue Mountains and Eastern Oregon Cascades, large trees over 21 inches in diameter make up only 3% of the trees in those forests. And that was from a 2020 study with Dr. Beverly Law and Dr. Drexler. And so, I think that surely we can protect the largest 3% of the large trees that are left on these side forests. And these big trees are also very resilient to fire and are crucial for providing clean, cold water. They need to be protected, not logged. And also we should not be logging the remaining mature and old forests, streamside forests, unlogged legacy forests, roadless areas, high quality wildlife habitats remaining on the landscape. Next slide. And again, I want to be really transparent here that not every logging unit out there looks as bad as some of these photos I've shared. They don't all contain old growth logging and clear cuts, but I want to point out some other widespread issues, because even when that's not the case, even when logging doesn't include clear cuts or logging of old trees, it's still causing widespread damage to wildlife, fish, water quality, and forest ecosystems. And so, that's particularly true as the Forest Service is increasingly targeting these ecologically sensitive areas for logging, and that includes mature and old forests, those roadless areas, forests and streamside buffers that are directly adjacent to streams, and moist mixed conifer forests. And they're also logging on increasingly steep slopes, like the ones I showed you in Tiger Mill, many of which are above creeks that have listed fish in them, like in the Tiger Mill sale. And then next slide. And then also on Eastside National Forest, we're finding mass conversion of complex, mature, and old mixed conifer forests to homogeneous ponderosa pine plantations. And so in these slides, the one on the left is a ponderous pine plantation, and that was left after past restoration logging. And then directly across the road, like you're looking at that, and then if you look across the road, you see that. And that old mature mixed conifer forest is the sale unit. That is what is targeted for logging, and unfortunately likely has probably been logged by now. Next slide. And then here's some more ponderosa pine plantations. That's in the Austin sale, the ponderosa pine plantations, and I'm gonna have you go back to this in a second, next slide. And that is right next door to this, which is the sale unit. And that happens again and again and again in the sale. And then previous slide. And then also I wanna note that, so like this other plantation is in the South George sale, that's my kiddo years ago. And then you can see the old ponderosa or pine plantation up above that. And you can see how like the hydrology has been affected and it's creating erosion down the slope. Next slide. And next slide. And so that's another timber sale unit in Austin sale. Incidentally, there's an open public comment period right now for this timber sale. You can talk to me about it afterwards to learn more. Next slide. And so I think I might be at time, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll just really note really quickly that there is a massive amount of collateral damage that comes with logging on national forests. So this is an example of open roads on the Mount Muir National Forest. And as Chad noted, the road system that we have in national forests is far beyond what is safe for wildlife and fish, and far beyond what is sustainable economically as well. And next slide. And we also have a huge water quality issue on national forests. And unfortunately, the Forest Service and timber industry have done really an excellent job of selling logging to the public as restoration and selling it as necessary for controlling fires or for public safety. Next slide. And so, you know, unfortunately, most people don't realize the extent or severity of logging taking place on federal public lands. And they don't get out on the ground before or after logging. So they often aren't familiar with the complexity and biodiversity of these forests before they were logged. And they don't see the aftermath of logging implementation. And even these photos don't come close to fully capturing what was lost. And so this unfortunate lack of understanding of what's really happening on the ground, that includes elected decision makers, many reporters, people in academia, large portions of the general public. And so the result is that this narrative that logging is restoration has become so widespread and accepted by the public that, and now the Trump administration, often with some degree, if not a lot, of bipartisan support, they've started ramping up logging to a really unprecedented degree. And so, you know, you may have all heard that Trump issued an executive order last year to increase logging by 25% on national forests. Next slide. And they've, in order to have this increased timber production, the administration has been working hard to enact regulatory changes and severely curtail, or in some cases entirely eliminate, public comment and participation in decision making. And so Brenna will talk more about that in just a second. And so, you know, I just kind of want to end with noting that, like, these critters need places to live, and most of them in these slides actually depend on maternal forests, complex forests, you know, mixed canopy, denser forests, large trees. And the Forest Service has no evidence that logging is good for wildlife, fish, water quality, or ecological integrity, because it is not. And so we need to fight for our forests to stay standing. Next slide.
Hi, that was great. My name is Brenna Bell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a senior staff attorney with the Craig Law Center, also on the steering committee of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. And I get to tell you how our government is making all of this easier and faster for the timber industry and harder for the rest of us. Are you doing this?
Do you want to click it?
So, this is something that I just need to start. Chad really talked about it, but I think it's so important whenever we talk to anybody about fire ever. We cannot log our way out of weather events. Oh, I see it, you don't see it. There, now you see it. We can't log our way out of weather events, right? The fires that people are worried about, that get a lot of attention, are the big catastrophic fires, the 2% of ignitions that cause like 90% of the burning. Those are weather events. And so if you forget everything else I say about the law, please remember that. So in the next conversation you have with people and they're like, we need to stop the big fires. You're like, how? How do we stop the wind? All right,
Nuclear
with that,
bomb in the hurricane, right?
yeah, with that I will talk actually about the law, because that's my role. So you might have noticed there's an emergency. Chad and Paula both highlighted how devastated our forests are and how much they need active management to protect them from this emergency. Yeah? No. Is that where we're all at right now? No, because we're in a world of doublespeak. And everything I say is only going to make sense if you have your doublespeak filter on. Because the words that are coming out of the government and the things that are on the ground are in such disconnect. We need our Orwellian filters to work. So there's these emergencies. And the first thing that Trump did in getting to office was put out a huge slew of executive orders. And I'm just going to focus on one. It came out about a year ago, on March 1st, 2025. It was called the Executive Order for the immediate expansion of American timber production, which called for this massive ramp up of federally managed forests. And this EO frames logging as the primary purpose of federal forest management and increasing timber production as a matter of national and economic security, and aimed to, quote, reverse the onerous federal policies that have prevented any ability to fully exploit our domestic timber supply. So that's the general gestalt of what we're working with. And the EO directed agencies to eliminate any existing policy, regulations, guidances, settlements that created an undue burden on logging in federal forests, setting deadlines for the agencies to comply with this. So they're expected to streamline analysis in their NEPA documents and also expedite review under the Endangered Species Act. And that executive order set the stage for the rest of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. While it doesn't really explicitly get into the fear of fire, it says we want to log in our national forests. We're going to use any mechanism that we can to get us there. Any mechanism that's in the scope of regulations, like what an executive agency can do without congressional interaction. So that executive order teed us up for this emergency situation determination that came out last April. And according to the secretarial memo implementing that, said that national forests are in crisis due to uncharacteristically severe wildfires. You're going to hear that a lot. Insects and disease outbreaks, invasive species, and other stressors whose impacts have been compounded by what? Climate change? No, too little active management. That is the problem. That is what's caused these emergencies, is too little active management. You know? And so this emergency over the forest is about 59% of all USF managed lands. It's 112,646,000 acres. And what it does is it says in places where this emergency situation exists, the Forest Service can go forward and do projects in an expedited manner in two main ways. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the agency is supposed to look at alternatives to the proposed action. For an EIS, it's considered the heart of the NEPA analysis. You have what the baseline is and then compare a different set of actions. And in looking at that comparison, decide the best course of action. But what the ESD says is, there's an emergency. There is not time to have this holistic alternatives analysis. So in all projects, you only need to analyze two things, act or don't act. So they're just streamlining the NEPA analysis. And then they also say, and because it's an emergency, we have to curtail public comment. And that's popping up all over the place. I'm not going to get into all the different ways that the agency is trying to curtail public comment. But in this, what it's doing is it's taking away a major step, which is called a pre-decisional objection. So typically in NEPA, before 2025, they do a draft, you comment, and then there's a final, and then there's this draft, comment, and then there's a time to do a pre-decisional objection. So before they make a final decision, you say, here's all the things, and as a lawyer, I'm like, I'm just gonna tell you all the reasons we're gonna litigate, and you have a chance to correct those before the final decision. It actually didn't always work, but sometimes it did. Sometimes the agencies would do the right thing and pull the most egregious or most illegal places of the project. And with the ESD, any project within the ESD, you don't have to do the pre-decisional objection step. And I should add, if a project is only 50% inside the ESD, you can still use the authority, right? So this covers almost 60% of Forest Service land, but then you can expand like the penumbra of ESD by having a project that's just half inside it. And so the emergency is almost everywhere. And then it has to be like an authorized emergency action, but the definition of what an authorized emergency action is also very, very expansive. It includes salvage of dead or dying trees, or trees damaged by natural disasters. So you can imagine a tree with fire scars, or a tree that had some wind damage that can now be salvaged. It has commercial or non-commercial sanitation harvest, I love that euphemism, of trees to control insects or disease, reforestation or replanting, removal of hazard trees in close proximity to roads and trails, as we saw includes downslope from such roads, removal of hazardous fuels, which are defined as pretty much anything. And this one will kind of touch on what Paul's going to talk about, restoration of water sources or infrastructure. And I want to note that water sources includes municipal watersheds, which are areas that have tend to be off limits to a lot of logging, and we're seeing a major focus with logging. So that's the kind of projects that can be done in these emergency situation determinant areas. That is one huge way that we're seeing the fear of fire come back in and strip public comment, strip good analysis. The next is the use of emergency regulations to avoid NEPA and ESA analysis. And emergencies are very popular with this administration. They're using this, like, environmental realm isn't the only realm where they're using emergencies to bypass law. But there are actual provisions in our laws to deal with emergencies, because there actually are emergencies. They do happen, right? The Endangered Species Act has an emergency provision for ESA consultation that says where emergency circumstance mandate the need to consult in an expedited manner. No, not forego consultation, but consult in an expedited manner. Consultation can be conducted informally through alternative procedures. So that exists. But then it goes on to say that this provision applies to situations involving, quote, acts of God, disasters, casualties, national defense, or security emergencies. Like real legit emergencies, right? Like that actually is a pretty good list. Sometimes there is a fire actively happening and they have to go in there and do something, or at least they think they do. And that's an emergency. They say response actions to prevent imminent loss of human property or life. Sorry, human life or property. So that's the ESA emergency regulations. And then there's these new NEPA regulations that have some emergency provisions that are a little bit more wishy-washy. They say that the agency can get emergency authorization where emergency circumstances exist that make it necessary to take urgently needed actions before a NEPA process can be completed, which I don't like as much, but there's still something there. There's still a little bit of there. They say emergency authorizations are limited to actions necessary to address the emergency circumstance. So that's a set of regulations we're working with, but then how has the Forest Service applied that under the Trump administration? That picture is an emergency. I want to talk a little bit about the North Trinity sale as a case study. This just happened in the Shasta Trinity National Forest down in Northern California. The North Trinity sale is a 12,000 acre project, and there was a scoping notice for the timber sale in 2024, November 2024. They said, we would like to do this project. It included fuels reduction, it included commercial timber, and then they kind of sat on it. They didn't actually complete a NEPA for the project. that happened in 2024. In August 2025, a fire happened near the project area. It burned about 500 acres. It's not a big, not a wind-driven fire. They were able to contain it. So we've got the scoping notice, we've got the fire. And then on October 15th, the Forest Service received approval from the regional office to conduct emergency actions in the project area, which are outside of the fire, on 1,200 acres of that project area. And you might think, okay, they're responding to the fire by doing the fuels risk reduction, right? Wrong. They are responding to the past fire by implementing the commercial timber sale component of the project that's been sitting on the shelf for a year because of an emergency. What's the emergency? It might burn. That's right. That is the emergency. So they said, because there was a fire near here, we are going to invoke the emergency provisions of the fire. And not only did they target the place where there was commercial logging, it was also where there are multiple occupied northern spotted owl nests. And so they had a duty under the Endangered Species Act to consult in some form, right? Even if it's an emergency, they still have some duty. But instead of making any decision under NEPA, doing any consultation, they started logging. They started logging on the day that they had the one public field trip that they were going to have in the area. And people only knew because members of the community were invited to the field trip. They went to find out what's happening, and they saw log trucks implementing the project while they were there. Because emergency. And so those groups reached out to Craig Lawson, or where I work, and my colleagues almost immediately dropped everything and challenged that timber sale in federal court, specifically on the grounds of overstepping what an emergency is. They said either this definition is, either there's not an emergency and they're not complying with the definition under NEPA, or they are complying with the definition and the definition of itself is too broad, right? Like one or the other, this has to stop. And the judge in the TRO hearing said, you're probably right on the merits. You're probably right that this is an overbroad definition of emergency. But to paraphrase, I don't want to be the guy that stops this logging so the whole town burns down. So, because this fear of fire, which was their entire brief, was like, fire, 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 so scary, it might burn, the judge was like, I'm not going to stop this logging. So it can go forward, we'll still make a decision on these merits about application of the emergency regulations to this project, but the logging all went forward because they were too afraid to stop the project. So this fear of fire that Chad's talking about, this like narrative, all those euphemisms that Paula is pulling up, they are having these real world impacts where the judges who say, yeah, this really feels illegal, I'm not gonna risk it. And I think a lot of people feel that. They don't want to be the one saying, don't log in this drinking watershed, don't log here, because what if a fire comes and then they get burnt?
Well, Brenda, when he said that about the TRO, that means he's never gonna do it.
Well, it was only 1,200 acres of the entire project, so we still have standing. Yeah, don't worry, Michael.
I was just getting mad.
Get mad, just not worried. Okay, next slide. I just wanted to do just a little fact check about this word unprecedented and uncharacteristic that we keep bumping into. What we really have on the landscape is a fire deficit. We have a big fire deficit. And so, the big block starts in, what's that little number? Like 1930. 1920? Okay, you all can see it better. 26 to like 40s, when we were in a really hot, dry period, correlated with the Dust Bowl. Think about that. We were like really in this drought. It's correlated with something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And then it got cool and moist. And it got cool and moist at the same time that the US military came back from World War II with a lot of war toys and a lot of guys who knew how to use them. And the combination of this cool, moist period and this like military industrial firefighting complex really suppressed fire on the landscape, to this point where people thought that was normal. People's baseline talking about unprecedented wildfires usually starts in 1980. And fire has a lot bigger return interval than 1980. So yeah, we've been on the rise since 1980. There's a couple of factors. the Pacific Decadal Oscillation changed, climate change. You know, we don't know if it's ever going to go back to cool and moist, but what we really don't have is an unprecedented amount of fires. And as Chad said, they are not burning uncharacteristically severe. So I just want to take a little fact check moment before moving on to the next piece, which is forest planning and how the Trump administration is trying to change all the forest plans in the area, in part based on this use of fire rhetoric to decrease standards and guidelines. So I'm not going to talk too much about forest planning, but for those of you who don't know about NIFMA, the National Forest Management Act, it basically says, and there's FLIPMA, which is its corollary in the Department of Interior, it says that for all federally managed forests, you need to have a plan. And the plan is kind of like, if you know zoning, it's kind of like a comprehensive plan. It allocates all the land into different land use allocations, and for each land use allocation, it gives specific desired conditions and standards and guidelines. And these overarching plans, like each forest has one, used to be each BLM district had one, and then there's like overarching plans over some of them. So what we're seeing right now is a massive increase in forest plan revisions, which honestly a lot of us wanted for a long time because most of them are out of date, but we didn't want them to happen right now. Because it's really bad what's coming out of the administration. So the Blue Mountains Forest Plan, that covers the Malheur, Umatilla, and Wallowa-Whitman National Forests in Northeast Oregon and Southwest Washington. Is this the third time they're trying to do it?
Yes.
This is their third attempt at changing the Blue Mountains Forest Plan. And each of those national forests has its own plan, but now they're trying to do a comprehensive plan over all of them. And I just want to highlight a couple of statements that they're making about fire and how you can just think about how that might infuse the standards and guidelines and the desired future conditions that are coming. So the Blue Mountains Forest Plan revision propaganda says, quote, while fire is important to the Blue Mountains, uncharacteristically severe fire is now an ecosystem stressor and a potential threat to these communities due to past management activities. Doesn't say anything about climate change, doesn't recognize the whole weather, oscillation, nothing. It just says past management activities. And then it says, over the last 35 years, okay, 1980, or actually they don't even do 80, what is that, 1990? Wildfires have increased in size and intensity, making them more complex and difficult to manage. Citizens, firefighters, natural resources, capital investments, and private lands within the 3 national forests are higher risk from uncharacteristic wildfire effects. Land management plan components and management strategies need to be revised to move uncharacteristic conditions toward desired ranges of vegetation, fuel loads, and habitats, which will promote resilient ecosystems and reduce risks to people and capital investments. Right, now that would be a reasonable sounding statement if you didn't just hear from Chad and Paul. Right, think about what they were talking about the research, and then what's happening on the ground, about what promoting resilient ecosystems looks like, and then apply that to a huge land planning operation. So we're kind of in the midst of Blue Mountain Forest Plan revision. As Paula said, more people need to care about the east side. So if you have like space in your heart to care about something else, that would be a really good one. Then there's the Northwest Forest Plan revision. And this is a regional forest plan that covers 18 national forests along the mostly west side of the Cascades, from Canada down to Northern California. And they've been trying to revise it for a while. Biden kind of got involved in it and started a lot of things, but like really moved too slow. And now he's out. There was a draft environmental impact statement from the Biden team. That's gone. What they said was, recognizing the increasing threat of severe wildfires, the proposed amendment prioritizes proactive fire management to protect communities and forests. It's like, maybe okay, but that statement reinterpreted with the Trump era fire rhetoric, we're just worried about what's gonna come out. So I'm going to leave you with what the Trump era rhetoric around fire is like, because we're gonna talk a little bit about the Bureau of Land Management Resource Management Plan revision that just got announced 2 weeks ago. So this is a kind of niche Oregon thing. We're the only state in the country that has an active BLM timber operation. Lucky us, they are the worst. But they're also honest. It's something I love about the BLM. The Forest Service uses a lot of euphemisms. They say we're doing meadow enhancement. They say we're doing, like ecosystem resilience. The BLM says we're fucking logging this place for timber volume because that's what we're supposed to do. And so when you look at their BLM plan revision, they intend to remove all the reserves and just focus on getting as much timber as possible. They say they're going to, I'm just leaving you with rhetoric. I'm sorry, but it's too good to not share. So we can be in pain together. Okay. Federal Register from 2 weeks ago says the BLM seeks to enhance its ability to implement forest treatments to mitigate the devastating effects of wildfire and to salvage timber killed by wildfire, drought, and other disturbances. High-profile events such as the 2018 Camp Fire in California, which was what? Wind-driven, caused billions of dollars of damages, highlights the urgent need for proactive management. At least they didn't use LA, which they're using to pass other fire things. And it says, this RMP revision will assist in reducing fuel loads. Remember, the main thing they're going to do is prioritize logging of all the remaining old growth in BLM managed. So they will assist in reducing fuel loads in order to battle these unprecedented and destructive fires and will aid in keeping the American people safe.
Thank God.
So that's what we are looking at. It's about to come. The fear of fire is infusing all of these management decisions, and if we can, we're really losing the rhetoric battle, but again, the one thing I want you all to remember is it's the wind. Paul?
You want me to go first? Okay. Okay, we're
A little over, sorry.
yeah, that's fine. It always happens. Okay, I'm Alex Bed. I'm the Alliance Organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, and kind of picking up from where Brenna left off, I'm going to talk about how can we try and tell a different story about forest fire and community safety. Because, and I'm going to also go fast, skip some slides so we make sure that Paul has time to talk, and hopefully we can get to a few questions. As several folks have already mentioned, currently forest policy and management is being driven by fear. The real fear that people across the region and the Western United States feel about losing their homes, their communities burning down. It's really important that we call out the bad science, the lies, the ways that that fear is being exploited and mobilized to facilitate extractive logging. But ultimately, if we can't speak to and shift that fear, we're going to be swimming upstream, and it's going to be really hard. And so I'm going to talk a bit about, how can we reframe the conversation to try and make a different future possible and resonate with people who are across the region feeling very afraid of losing their homes and communities. And that may counterintuitively mean talking a little bit less about forests and forest management. Again, in order to shift public perception and policy priorities, we need to offer people a different story that's compelling, one that speaks to the anxiety and fears that people feel, has clear protagonists and antagonists that they identify and disidentify with, and points towards a better future that resonates with people. I want to talk about how our messages often boil down, because most people in the general public do not get the level of detail that Chad and Paula and Brenna have shared doesn't trickle down to most people. So on the one hand, we hear industry and agencies saying more logging and active management will prevent destructive fires. For most people, that boils down to do something. And when we say more logging is environmentally destructive and it won't keep people safer, for a lot of people that boils down to don't do something. If it's do something versus don't do something, that is a messaging and rhetoric battle that we're going to keep losing with a lot of the public. So what can we do about that? Reframing the problem is a big part of that. It's not in the forest, the problem is where people live. For example, in the Gulf Coast, there are no only you can prevent hurricane marketing campaigns. Because it's just accepted that hurricanes are a natural part of that ecosystem and a thing that's going to happen. We can't control that. What we can do is make sure that homes and communities and people are safe within that context. And so by reframing the problem to focus on homes and communities igniting and burning down, that's a problem that we can actually solve. controlling vegetation and fire across tens of millions of acres in fire-adapted ecosystems is not a problem we're ever going to be able to solve. And so that means the most important and effective solutions are the things that happen in communities, not in the forest. It's retrofitting homes to be ignition resistant, creating defensible space, the same things that folks have been talking about, and community-led resilience efforts. And it's not on here, but I think we also need to talk more about smoke, because like by the numbers, that is what most people, the way that they are most directly impacted by fires across the region. And then again, just to reinforce something that's come up again and again, reframe the driver of these really destructive fires in terms of like the loss of communities and structures. These are weather and climate driven events, not fuel driven events. It's important to focus on the underlying and structural causes: climate change, fire suppression, fire vulnerable development, and industrial plantation forestry. But these big destructive fires, the fast moving fires, those are only like 2 or 3% of the fires that get started and take place, but they cause 90% of the structure loss. And just as one example of that, the Camp Fire in 2018, there were 50+ mile-an-hour winds, there was extreme heat and drought, and those conditions, those weather conditions, were blowing burning embers 5 miles ahead of the flame front. The town of Paradise could have paved around the town with cement for like 2 miles, and those burning embers still would have fallen into the town and ignited people's homes, and the town still would have burned. This isn't a problem we can solve in the forest. We have to make communities and structures more resistant to catching fire and burning in the first place. Here are 2 different message examples, and I don't disagree. I think they're both right, but just to compare how they will land for most people in the general public. On the one hand, historically, we actually used to have a lot more fire in the landscape than we do today. We have a fire deficit, and more fire is good for forests after 100+ years of fire suppression. And if people are building homes in the WUI, that means we need to accept the risk of fire there. More logging is going to be ecologically damaging. Compare how that lands with a message, for example: we all deserve to live in peace and safety, not spending every summer fearing that we'll lose our homes and communities. Protecting homes and communities should be our top priority, not creating more profits for industry by spending money logging in the backcountry instead of spending money protecting homes. So again, I'm pulling all of this. I'll skip the slide. Most of what's in here is from a new wildfire messaging guide that the Forest Climate Alliance just put together, and there'll be a QR code for you to download that. But again, how can we put these pieces of effective storytelling together to tell a different story that people can see themselves in, and that speaks to their the deeper fears and anxieties and emotions, because people often remember how a message feels rather than the facts and figures and statistics. For example, communities and neighbors are already leading the way, protagonists, making their homes and neighborhoods more fire resistant through retrofitting, creating defensible space, highlighting real solutions, all while politicians are neglecting community safety to focus on subsidizing handouts to their big timber donors, protagonists. Their plans increase fire risk to surrounding communities, put money in corporate pockets, not local ones, and take resources away from protecting the livelihoods of hardworking Oregonians, residents, whatever. Again, highlighting the harm to communities of the status quo. Okay. So again, we need to be validating the fear and anxieties that people feel about losing their homes and the impacts of smoke to that, centering community protection, and reframing the issue from vegetation and fire control to preventing structure ignition in the first place. Highlighting communities, folks, everyday people, as already the protagonists. So many people are already doing this work at their own homes and at the community level, and we want to lift that up and contrast that with politicians and the wealthy, who for every dollar they're spending on backcountry logging, that is a dollar that is not being spent on making homes and communities safer, and call that out. I'm going to hand it over to Paul because I know we're running out of time. I want to make sure we have time for some questions. But this QR code will take you to the Wildfire in the Age of Climate Change, this new communications resource that we just put together that has everything I just talked about and a lot more. There's also copies on the Forest Climate Alliance table over in the law school building. So Paul,
I need to stand up because I have a lot of energy moving through my body right now. My name's Paul. I'm unaffiliated. I'm some guy. That's my credential. I will say everything that's been spoken about today lives in my body in a really, really profound way, and I've become deeply passionate about these issues very recently, having cared about forest issues for a long time, specifically because of the tiger mill sale that Paula brought up and showed some photographs of. I live in Walla Walla in southeastern Washington, about 20 miles from that project area. it is one of the most precious, beautiful, ecologically diverse places left in the United States. And it is partly because it's very inaccessible, so it's really hard to log. So it's, for a number of different reasons, led to an incredible, intricate, mosaic of different forest types, different ecologies, and is a place that is worth protecting in its own right for many, many different reasons. There's another wrinkle to the Tiger Mill project that might actually get a little closer to home for many of the people in my community at least, which is that the project comprises the entire municipal drinking water supply of my town. It's about a 25,000 acre watershed that is very heavily protected. It's one of the most heavily protected parts of the northern Blue Mountains. In fact, you can go to jail if you set foot in the watershed, because any human disturbance would have a negative impact on water quality. So when I heard about a $38,000 timber sale and active management project in the municipal watershed and all of the surrounding forests, including moist, mixed conifer, upland forests that are old growth, many of which have never been logged, I was like, why the fuck would anyone think that this is a good idea? And so I'm gonna try my best to just keep this really tight, but I think it's really important to frame this because like Chad's book found me in that moment, and it was a lifeline for me to feel so validated in just the maddening, the madness that is born out of this doublespeak propaganda. It is so hard to even stomach it. So I'm in a community of people who believe that for the most part, people are good and want the right things. And so when they read that the Forest Service is doing a forest health treatment project that's for forest resilience, and it's to reduce the unevaluated risk of high severity fire in our municipal watershed, crippling our water supply, it's like, we want this. We want the forest to do something, to your point, Alex. So I'm up against, on the one hand, people are like, well, the Forest Service says that they're doing this, and I'm on the other side saying, yeah, but actually this is what it looks like on the ground. And so I go into the weeds, and I feel like it's relevant to go a little bit into the weeds on this one, and talk about basal areas. So I'm reading the Tiger Mill environmental assessment, I'm reading the finding of no significant impact, and I'm trying to understand how they can justify that there will be no measurable increase in sedimentation or any hydrologic impact whatsoever from massive industrial logging on steep slopes, over 50%. And you get into the details, and it's talking about basal area prescriptions, these treatments, or prescriptions, they're silvicultural, it's sort of using medical language and sanitation, all of this stuff. And when you actually get into the details, what is basal area? Well, one place it's defined as the total cross-sectional area of the timber. In another place, it's defined as the total cross-sectional area of all vegetation, which includes an unestimated amount of biomass. So a basal area prescription of up to 70% basal area reduction is based on an ambiguous and unestimated biomass quantity. So basically, what does that mean? The only provision in the actual timber contract, not the environmental assessment, the timber contract says the only unambiguous provision specifying what mechanical thinning is leave the largest 3 trees per acre. That is the only enforceable thing. But you can cut them down if they interfere with the cable for the cable haul thing. So this is like, you go into the weeds 400 pages deep and you'll go insane. And until you read Chad's book and you're like, oh my God, I'm not the only one who feels this. And then reach out to Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, or they contacted me. So to Paula and Karen's credit, one of the most important organizations in my bioregion, and I owe you a great debt of gratitude. So that's me zooming into like very, very kind of like granular detail, and then zooming out a little bit, like how do I do something about this? So in my community, I'm realizing that the biggest deficit is actually education. It's like we can't even begin to have a conversation about the science and getting into the weeds because for the most part, people don't really have the time or the patience to go there. So, I've been kind of trying to figure out how to organize in a rural community where it's just a different political landscape, it's a different time, and there's some good people out there who are on my team, and we had a field trip. A geologist went out and we did a geology field trip out in the Mill Creek watershed where all of this logging is going to happen. And you know, we're looking at the geology, and then also like, oh, and by the way, you know, these trees are all going to get cut down, and all of a sudden, the 75 people who all wanted to learn about geology are really interested and worried about this timber sale, and they came to the information session. And then after 6 months of lobbying city council, we got a town hall, and we packed city hall. And it was relatively successful organizing under the idea that free community education is one of the best strategies, it's one of the best tools that we have as organizers and activists. So I'm gonna try and just bring it home. For me, it's really close to home because it's, you know, my favorite place in the entire world. I think it's a sacred place. I don't want to see it destroyed. And it's also close to home because it's literally the life support infrastructure for my entire town. Why are they doing this? If you really get there, and I would be happy to provide a lot of literature to back up this position, the point of this project is to build a scientific justification, to use my community as a sacrifice zone, to build a more robust scientific validation tool to sell industrial logging as a natural climate solution that can then participate in carbon markets. We're talking about carbon, we're talking about fire. Fire needs fuel. Fuel is carbon. Carbon is a greenhouse gas. So when fires burn, all of the forest carbon then turns into carbon dioxide. So if we log it, we're gonna put that carbon dioxide somewhere where it's not gonna burn. Climate change, okay. Final point. What is the most significant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere? Water vapor. It is the most significant greenhouse gas in our atmosphere. Climate is not a geophysical, it is not a chemical phenomenon. Climate is a biological phenomenon. I've always believed this. I've always studied the way that forest ecology anchors hydrology. But forests are the absolute most important resource that we have for anchoring terrestrial climate systems. They evapotranspirate moisture along with the bioaerosols and basidiospores that actually allow for cloud formation over the continents. That's the only reason we have rainfall. There's a direct correlation between deforestation and desertification. So if you're worried about climate-driven megafires, you should be worried about desertification. If you're worried about desertification, you should be worried about protecting forests, not cutting them down. So more than I think it's about like wind, it's actually about water. And I would like to reframe the fire debate into a water debate because I really, really want my community to continue to be able to draw water from the watershed for municipal water, keep water in the rivers for the fish, keep water in the ground, and it's a really, really tough uphill battle. So,
Water is life.
yeah, thanks to all of you, and thanks for being here.
We've got 5 minutes for questions.
I had a question for Brenna. You talked about the developments that are coming up in terms of forest plan revisions. I was just trying to hear a little about the role of the Congressional Review Act and its implications for management plans. Is that something you've looked into? And if so, how would that influence the forest plans that you're working on?
I haven't yet. I'm gonna defer any other lawyers in the room who have. Anybody? Okay, I'm gonna take that back as a research question, Doug, and I'll get back to you.
Well, just a little bit, I've worked on some of the, I'm not an attorney, but I work on policy related to the Congressional Review Act.
Okay.
And one of the things that we're concerned about that is that we're seeing that they're using it differently. And for any of the management plans that are getting challenged under the Congressional Review Act, it means that if they get overturned, that any new management plan can't look anything similar to the one that gets overturned.
Wow.
And so this is very concerning, especially seeing how we're seeing like the Escalante's Grand Staircase for that National Monument Management Plan. That's the first one that's getting overturned for a national monument, which is extremely devastating because that's a very diverse landscape. So a lot of the different environmental groups or groups working on monuments, they're trying to sound the alarm on this pretty significantly because all of the hard work that went into establishing those monument or management plans in general are going to get thrown out if they get overturned by the CRA. But happy to chat about that afterwards.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, when he says overturned, I believe what he's meaning is congressionally overturned.
Yes.
That's happening with some of the BLM plans up at the south of Florida. RFPs cover millions of acres.
Jason, we'll see how far we get.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, and kind of to Paul's story, the Climate Alliance, I know there's a number of organizations involved, millions of dollars in nonprofit spending, dozens of organizers and staff. And so I'm curious about what other stories you all have as an alliance or organizationally about frontlines education and outreach, about impacted communities, about what we're doing to get the message. I mean, no offense, but to not be preaching to the choir all the time and to do rural organizing with the people who you're talking about here, who are the fear drivers who need this messaging. Like, folks who don't know, I'm a rural person. I live amongst the BLM lands. I do a lot of rural organizing, but I'm still not seeing this really as a rural organizing project. And so I wonder if you guys could speak to that into frontline communities.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, there's a huge problem with the organizations and the money and everything within the conservation world still being super concentrated in like Eugene and Portland, at least in Oregon for the most part. We've been doing some work on that with the forest timelines of last year, connecting with folks like Paul. There's a group, the Methow Forest Forum in Northern Washington in the Methow Valley that we connected with, and a similar thing of like the way it often seems to go is that there's a big Forest Service fuel reduction, fire resilience project that gets popped up and local folks are concerned about it and they reach out and we connect with them and then try and provide resources and support. So up there Chad came out and did an amazing talk with some of the local folks there. There were 200 people came out in Winthrop for Chad's talk, and then they also talked about the Midnight Project is what the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest Project there that kind of catalyzed this was. We're going to be going back out to show Elemental, the film, and that's an example of, in some ways, the Methow Valley is like a more liberal than like the typical rural community for sure. But I'm working with a person down in Weimar in Southern Oregon who also is interested in having someone like Chad or other scientists come out to speak about this, and there are tricky questions there about how do we navigate around that. How do we do that kind of like public education work that can kind of unpack the underlying things driving these projects, and to what extent do we do that while trying to get people to engage with the project or do it in a bigger picture detached from the project? Because when there's a specific proposal and the Forest Service is saying, we're gonna do this and it's gonna make your community safer, like it can be very polarizing and people kind of revert to the narratives and those polarized positions. But there's so much more that needs to be done around that. And yeah, it does mean, ultimately that's like relationship building and pushing resources out to smaller grassroots groups in rural areas. And that's like a bigger structural thing, but I think I'm seeing more of a recognition that needs to happen, that in order to actually shift the narrative here and shift public perception, that's work that doesn't need to be done in Portland and Eugene and Seattle. That's work that needs to be done by supporting people like Paul on the ground in these communities who are trying to do that work. And for organizations that have the resources, that means pushing those resources out and sharing them.
And that is one of the reasons why we updated the Wildfire project right now, and we're making it as widely possible, like available as possible, is people just need help in knowing how to talk about these in a way that can resonate with people who actually live in the places.
Yeah, I'm Karen Coulter with the Biodiversity Project, and I wanted to tag on to something that Paula said, which is the Austin sale. And I wanted to have people remember that you can send comments in on this sale now. The action order should be on the Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project.org website. And I just want to say how this works a little bit. Like, most of the sales are being under the guise of fire risk reduction, when actually it's just to extract a lot of logging. And I just want to say for credibility that I've been through 2 major fires at my place. And the first time I was devastated. It was a stand replacement fire and piles of ash everywhere and dead trees. And I'm so glad I stayed there. It was completely rejuvenated. All the native plants were increased, and then I went through, and so when the second fire came, 28 years in between, because I'm on an edge where it would be frequent fire intervals actually, and the climate change driven fire went so fast that it didn't actually kill that many trees. It was burning up the roots, but it wasn't near the ignition, which the previous one was right near the ignition. But in both cases, there's a native seed bank of plants and trees and everything and that ecosystem needs fire, and doesn't have enough fire, and wildfire suppression is one of the major problems. And then I just wanted to say about the Austin sale, we field surveyed it in 2019, and they did some scoping for comments, and then when there was litigation about the 21-inch limit for logging, and they wanted to log large trees, they put it on hold to wait to log large trees, and then they waited further until Trump got elected and until further, and they got the emergency situation.
Yeah,
That was an emergency.
Yes,
It's been in
and
the works
so-
since 2019.
Right, and so they were on, it was on hold that long, and they slapped on 8 forest plans amendments that they didn't have in the initial scoping. And then, the other thing that I just wanna say is in my comments, I said, this is not an emergency. You decided to put it on hold for years for political reasons, and what is a real emergency? The real emergency, for an example, was when in 2024, there were so many fires across the whole Nile here, they had to do a closure on the entire forest and block roads, and that was for public safety, and that's an example of an emergency. It's not the timber stuff.
Also, the Austin sale's 35,000 acres of logging.
Yeah.
As many new
I-
projects.
We are bumping in on time, so
Yeah.
I wanna give people the option to leave, cause I know at least any of us who have to deal with BLM stuff have to go right now. But I wanted to invite people to continue this conversation tonight at the Forest Climate Alliance party,
Nice.
hey.
Nice.
Yeah, we're gonna be there, it's at Area 52, is that what it's called?
Plain 52.
Plain 52,
Brewing.
from 7 to 11 tonight.
What
You can
52?
grab
Plain.
us, talk about fire, talk about logging, talk about things that have nothing to do with fire and logging, that we're fun people to talk to. We can find out what you're doing. Please come and hang out and support the Forest Climate Alliance. And if you're thinking you work somewhere in the Northwest at the intersection of climate and forest, which many of us do, and you're not part of this network yet, get us up at the table. And thank you, Alex, for